Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 11th New Yorker Festival. My name's Simon Sharma. I've been told, you must have been told already, right? Sort of turn your cell phones off. My favorite moment, actually, is how many of you have seen an immortal work of historical imagination, Spamalot, where somebody comes to the front and says, we'd like you all to turn your cell phones on because the show is crap. Not going to happen in our case, so bloody well turn them off. It's my huge pleasure to, don't really need to introduce you, but to moderation, not usually a quality associated with Sharma, but to moderate this session on living history with three of the greatest living writers in the United States now, Peter Carey, Annie Proulx and E.L. Doctorow, who between them have just garnered every award you can possibly imagine, from the Pulitzer to Peter's won 2 Bookers, is up for his 3rd. Edgar Doctorow keeps on winning the National Book Critics Circle Award, rightly. Annie Proulx and Pulitzer. You all know they're very great novels. It would be insulting for me, really, actually, to sort of list them. So we're going to start by, I was going to do some tremendously open, simple question to start with, like why are you drawn to writing about the past? But in the green room back there, without being particularly asked, Carey over there immediately says, well, I bloody well hate the term historical fiction. Why? What's wrong with it?
Well, it just sounds like something I wouldn't want to read, really, I think. And I've never even... I don't really distinguish between really about writing about the future or writing about the past. And actually, the nicest thing anybody ever said about my work was Jonathan Miller about a book of mine called Oscar and Lucinda, which is set in the Victorian age, who said, oh, yes, he said, I get it. It's sort of a science fiction of the past. And I still can't quite figure it out, but it feels right to me. So I don't distinguish. And because I suppose there is in my head this sort of notion that there's a genre called historical fiction. And I'm really interested in literature, and it encompasses everything.
You're just being a snob about bodice rippers, you know.
Sorry?
You're just being a snob about bodice rippers.
Give me a bodice and I'll see how I go. But I don't know. It wouldn't have occurred to me, no.
Well, I think I will actually revert to the original question, actually. But I would like to ask Ed Doctorow in particular, actually, who's written. It's true also. I don't know if you'd accept this, actually, that Book of Daniel, maybe World's Fair are about a continuum from sort of past through a sort of present. But unless I'm wrong, you've mostly really wanted to absorb yourself in past time. These other two flirt around with.
Well, no, actually, I'm afraid I have to agree with Peter. I don't believe I write historical fiction.
Right. This is going to be one of these sessions where all the panelists, deny the premise of the thing. So I'm going, carry on, please.
We don't like labels. We don't like modifiers on the word novelist. And if you start to think about, well, there is a genre of sort of costume fantasies. We won't talk about those historical novels.
You finally said it. Everybody's been dodging around, afraid to say the dreaded words historical novel, which carries a lot of ugly baggage.
Yeah.
Well, War and Peace, are we all going to spit on the tomb of Tolstoy here? What is so embarrassing about the historical novel?
No, we don't think of War and Peace as an historical novel.
I think he did, actually. Don't you think?
Well, here's the thing. After a while, when the book was written, falls away, and there's just the internal time of the novel, and the author's gone, and what defines a historical novel? The Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne wrote about a period 150 years before his life. Mark Twain wrote his Boyhood pair of novels. We don't call those historical fiction. And then you may say, well, what about if you use historical verifiable characters? Doesn't that make it something? And then, well, I wrote a book called World's Fair. It takes place in the 1930s. I used my own childhood as a source for this book. I named everyone in my family with their real names. And but nobody knew them. They were not historically famous. But what is the ontological difference between using people everyone knows and using people nobody knows? There is none. So as you start to analyze the idea of an historical novel, it just begins to dissipate. And I don't think of War and Peace as an historical novel. I don't think of Stendhal's work as a historical novel. They're novels. They're novels. And that's my opinion.
It is slightly weird to me, actually. Yes, I mean, you feel the same, Annie, do you? I mean, this word history is really a contaminant, is it?
It is. It shouldn't be. But when you think of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, is it an historical novel? Yes, of course it is. At the same time, it's not. It's a fine piece of literature. And Patrick White's Voss and Sigrid Undset's Master of Hest-Deacon series and so forth, these could be called historical novels, and yet we don't. We call them literature because the words historical novel are somehow tainted, and I'm not quite sure how or why.
It's a little weird to me, this, actually, because arguably one of the first novels it's a fantasy. It's true, it's Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, it's 1470, but more significantly it is sort of, magic fantasy land about the Arthurian legend. But fast forward to the early 18th century, Defoe publishes in 1722 Journal of the Plague Year, possibly the first, no disrespect to Pilgrim's Progress, but possibly the first great English masterpiece, which he takes excruciating pains, actually, to present a world in which he was actually only 5 years old, as if he was a mature person. And he wants you to believe, and he does what you've all done, actually, as well, at certain times. He cuts into it, we would say, builds a mortality, elements of actual material past, actually, into something, however, that he's entirely invented. And was that a kind of trivial exercise? What, Peter?
I think maybe really the problem is really the label, and so
okay.
So what does one assume? I mean, there are people who just like to read what is called historical fiction, and I'm not a person who likes to write. Just might be called historical fiction. So I don't understand somebody who would only want to read books set in the past. I think we at least I, and I'm sure the others, only go to the past because we see the past in the present every day, and that we are interrogating really the present. And we would be doing, and in my case, I would be doing that if I was writing science fiction, or if I was writing something that was in the present, or something that was set in the past. And something about the label suggests that we have no interest in our present time. And I think that's not useful.
Well, let's leave the label trailing in the dust behind us.
Well, I'm just thinking of a parallel work is Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage. He wasn't there. It's probably the best novel about the Civil War that's ever been written. He wasn't a participant. But we have the book now, and it doesn't matter when he wrote it. All novels are about the past, the near past, the far past. Look at Thomas Mann's tetralogy, The Joseph and His Brothers. He wrote 4 huge volumes based on a few verses in the Bible. Now, do we call that a historical novel? It's a total confection, what it is. And and then there's the whole issue of time, the physicists today are staying away from this whole issue of what time is, because it's so difficult for scientists to figure out. And I remember reading somewhere that the Greeks had the idea that the future came at your back, and what you saw out there was the past. And we fill time with history, but so much of history is not that straight arrow of time, as it goes around in circles. Since World War II, some 15 million people have been killed in mass murders, politicides, genocides, ethnic cleansing, and that doesn't suggest to me the time goes forward at all. So then you start to think about these things. The idea of calling a novel historical novel just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, fine. As I said, let's leave it soiled and trailing in the dust.
Yes.
But the initial question, which I should have asked really, I suppose, was why. I mean, you'd all accept that you. Peter's already said this, really, that you are interested in the past, that you're using the past, albeit, maybe to sort of say something about the present. But you, Annie, I mean, not all of your, stories are, but take Accordion Crimes, for example. That is, an epic in its way, isn't it? I mean, it starts a very particular moment with the lynching in New Orleans, ends a century later or so. So if we. So it's and some of the most powerful Indian wars we fought, them old cowboy songs, sweep right through time in your landscape. So that's important to you, isn't it? Unless I got it wrong.
Yes, and I came to fiction by way of history.
You did a degree in it, I think.
I did.
Yes.
I did. Yes, strangely believe it. And at the time I was doing my graduate work, I fell under the spell of the Annales School, invented 80-odd years ago, by Marc Bloch and I forgot.
Lucien Febvre.
Thank you. Yes, Lucien Febvre, and then later came Bourdelle and La Walladourie and the rest of the crowd. And this was a break from the old history that what we used to laughingly call king and queen history. These fellows, the original Annales chaps, were economists, and they took a holistic approach to the subject, began examining geography, climate, the lives of small people who didn't count. They weren't subjects. They were worth looking at, and a lot of that rubbed off on me. So when I started writing fiction, I began approaching everything I wrote from the standpoint of geology, which gives you a rather wonderful sense of time. But this whole business of writing and history and time is very interesting. I don't know how many people here know the work of the Irish stylist Aidan Higgins. His entire oeuvre is based on his own past. Everything that he has written, and he's written quite a lot, is an examination of what happened to him in various places, times, countries, with various lovers, and so forth. And fiction springs out of these memories. Nothing is solid. Nothing is real. You cannot trust Aidan Higgins for a second. Time is jelly.
Sounds like all historians.
That too, because historians and history and the Annales School, as well as any others, shift and change. So that we've got this wonderful, greasy, kind of swampy bog of semi-facts and half-memories and possibilities and time, which makes it rather fun to be a writer.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting to me, because I, Yanal meant a lot to my generation, and in your work actually, now it all makes a lot of sense actually. history is a very impersonal thing. I mean, droughts and depressions and famines come and go, and ant-like figures get crushed by these, as you said, geological. But, Edgar, you said a few minutes ago it doesn't make any difference whether there is somebody we know about and somebody we don't know about. But Houdini appears in Ragtime, as does Evelyn Nesbit, and in The March, a book I absolutely love, General Sherman famously. In fact, someone called Dr. Ruff actually appears in War and Peace, doesn't he, actually? General Dr. Ruff. But it's Sherman I want to ask you about there, because it's an incredibly convincing portrait of Sherman's internal monologues and his general persona. So wasn't there a way you felt you had to sort of inhabit that person? Did you go to biographies or letters or...
Oh, you mean how much research did I do?
Well, not quite as crudely as that, but whether or not... yeah, I saw that coming up there.
Well, my answer is just enough.
But graduate students always want to ask poor professors, how much should I do? I'll remember just to tell them just enough, actually. But how much is just enough?
Well, usually the question comes from someone who is wonders if it's legitimate at all to represent a historically verifiable character. In your own terms, have that person say things that he may not have said or do things that he may not have done. But the answer to that, and you use the right word, you use the word portrait. This is we're taking in a figure of that note. You're doing what the painter does who paints a portrait. This is your version. This is your reading, your interpretation of that person, and I see nothing wrong with that. The person who's reading a novel understands that there's a certain degree of freedom involved here, and but as generally speaking, somewhere along the line, I discovered that a period of time was as much a principle for constructing a novel as a place was. So that, for instance, to come up a notch or two, if Faulkner had his little county in Mississippi, I had in that book the first decade of the 20th century. And that sort of framed things for me. But the spirit of that book is not realistic. It's not a realistic novel. It's a rather impertinent sort of mock historical chronicle. When that book was published, I was astounded that some people thought I had somehow transgressed and done something I shouldn't have done, when I grew up on books such as Tolstoy, such as Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo and the Three Musketeers, where historical characters were used constantly. But that book, published in 1975, came at a time when I think fiction was generally timid, and the fictional tropes had been taken over by the social scientists, and of course the journalists had moved in, like Tom Wolfe and Mailer and Truman Capote, and we were kind of being put on the reservation. And I had this feeling that if they want facts, I'll give them facts. I'll invent the greatest facts that. But it's just whatever you do by going to a historical character, making a fiction out of you, discover that person made a fiction out of himself or herself long before you got there. Yeah. For instance, in that book, J.P. Morgan is a character. And if you really want to read fiction about Morgan, you should read his authorized biography. Or, for that matter, Henry Kissinger's memoirs.
The left never lies about itself, of course, actually, does it? But here's a passage from. You're absolutely right. I mean, I was astonished to hear actually at Hay on Wye Festival last spring, friends and colleagues of mine, I wasn't there, actually complaining that historical novelists ought never really to invoke actual characters like J.P. Morgan or General Sherman, because it confuses, it's sort of an insulting and patronizing notion of readers to suppose that they don't understand they are actually reading fiction. It seemed to me absurd. But here is Dr. Rowe, actually, who's now backing off from the notion of really occasionally making history on the pages. It's a wonderful passage from Ragtime, but you're just being a professor at this point. At the time, of course, this is actually a time of economic and social conflict. You're glaring at me. Is this a naughty thing to do? It's a passage I love. Millions of men were out of work. Those fortunate enough to have jobs were dared to form unions. Courts enjoined them. Police busted their heads. Their leaders were jailed. New men took their jobs. A union was an affront to God, and so on. That's actually very accurate and vivid account, which any historian would be thrilled to have written, actually. So it's fine at some point then to, in the fiction, as Victor Hugo does, as Tolstoy does, as Flaubert does in Sentimental Education, to sort of thicken the historical scene. You do it too. In Parrot and Olivier, the new book, there's a wonderful, wonderful account quite close to the beginning, Peter, of royalists actually who expected their moment to come suddenly being confounded by Napoleon returning during 100 days. So you turn historian at that point to some degree.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my project really is to make stuff up. And if I want you, particularly, to read my book, I want to, as much as is possible, make myself bulletproof, because I don't want to lose credibility with you, Simon. So I really want to tick off all of the things that I can tick off and know what I can know. So then I can do what I really want to do, and the forces of history will work on my characters, just as the forces of geology and topography and climate will work on all of our characters as well. So, but I get a lot of pleasure out of doing all the work and ticking off all of those things. So I can be free to completely invent.
All three of you, actually, one of the most powerful and beautiful things about your work is literally a feeling, a sort of, you'll all agree out there, I mean, the texture of daily life, more anal, Annie. It's actually the taste of things, the physical feel of things. I'm not going to read it out, Edgar, but there's a fantastic sort of passage of actually a streetcar ride in the Bronx, actually, early in the century, which is... So, I mean, presumably that does, as you've suggested, Peter, give you a lot of pleasure, actually, sort of getting the kind of physical place and texture right. Again, Waterworks, we were talking about early on, is amazing about the New York that was, actually. I don't know if you want to talk about the pleasures of that, the sort of archive.
I think writing fiction gives you an endowment somehow. Henry James spoke of a sensibility that finds the very pulses of the air, can yield a revelation of some sort. And I think that's true. If you're writing factually, if you're writing a newspaper article or a corporate report or something, that doesn't give you the kind of intuitive grasp of things. The whole writing process is different. You write to find out what you're writing, and you don't feel possessive about anything you're doing. You're making discoveries just the way the reader does who reads those sentences. And whatever comes of this, trusting that process is almost accidental. And so many writers will have different ways of speaking of this. Saul Bellow said he felt like a medium. And Mark Twain said, worse the effect that he doesn't write a book that doesn't write itself. You have this sense of taking sometimes silent dictation. But that kind of idea of creativity is not restricted to fiction, in my view. For instance, Albert Einstein, when people asked him about his two theories, relativity, he said he sometimes thought that he didn't create them, that the entire scientific community somehow put it together, and he was the one who wrote it down. That feeling of remoteness from what you accomplish is a characteristic of this thing. So that's what writing fiction means. That's why when Peter and Annie hold back the idea of modifying the word novelist, because it doesn't really help anything. And people do put labels on I don't know about you, but some people said to me, "Oh, you're an historical novelist." Oh. And someone else said, you've written political things in your books. You have a political... Yeah, okay, you could say that. And someone says, and you use postmodern techniques, don't you? And I said, oh, I guess I do. And someone else says, and you're a New York novelist, and your books have taken place in New York. So, okay, that's one way to look at it. And then you're a genrist. Billy Bathgate is a gangster novel, and your first novel takes place in Dakota Territory. So the label now reads like this: I'm a historical, political, postmodern New York genrist.
No, you're someone who really does love writing about the past. I don't know why you're so shy about that. Sure. Are you going to disclaim that?
He's not shy.
that doesn't put you on in any kind of pigeonhole at all, I think. Let's talk about. Can we talk about? I did just want to actually, Annie. It did seem to be, one does, as I say, get a very sort of physical flavour, actually, of what was. And I just wonder whether the sense of, in your Wyoming stories, maybe even in Accordion Crimes, of loss, I mean, it is important for you. Things are, in a very tough landscape, often kind of falling apart. I won't call it historical vision. The vision of the past is often tragic. I mean, it's that sense, actually, of recovering like an imaginative archaeologist, another, sort of the physical detail, way people dressed, how their houses were important to you?
That was rather a long question. It began
Sorry,
with
yeah.
a sense of...
Really? I can't
the
believe
sense of loss. What specifically did you ask about loss?
Well, I was just thinking, actually, that, time is... you're interested in a passage of time in the landscape you want to write about. So
Yes. But the loss, the question of loss,
yeah.
If it's there, it's the reader's choice. I don't think about it.
Right.
So, the reader's a partner.
Right. No, I just meant that there are, deaths happen and landscapes disappear and the depression happens.
Yes.
And that. Yeah.
Right.
And then the readers come and give them meaning. Right?
Yes.
Right.
Right. Well, I just see that a good deal of life is that way, full of loss, if you will.
Right.
And, things ending and not always sugar-coated, smiling rainbow finishes to things. So I write it like I sees it, I guess.
Right. So nothing particular about the time aspect.
No, because I think the same set of events probably can happen in every time.
Right.
With modifications, of course, depending on the place and the geology. But no, I don't write to get across a sense of loss for a particular time.
Okay.
If it's there, it's there.
Right. Can we talk about voice a little bit? Peter in Parrot and Olivier, they're two very, very distinctive voices. Actually, Ned Kelly, which the Kelly Gang, True History of the Kelly Gang, that's a very powerful, distinctive sort of voice that you wrote it in. Can you talk a little bit about how you arrive at that?
This is my chance to be really interesting, but I'm going to be very disappointing because, in the case of Parrot and Olivier, in both of them, for all the things that I worry about in a book, and clearly I fret and scratch around a lot, and like Edgar said, one is always in the process of finding what one means, and what is this about, and who are these people really, and what sort of a person would really do that thing. So it's not. So all the time one is discovering things, but in the case of Parrot and Olivier, the voices of the two characters are, in the finished book, almost the beginning is exactly as I sat down and wrote them on the first day. Mm-hmm. And I think the essence of the problem, which was terrifying to me, as I think I did tell you once, the thing of writing about this French aristocrat, was really frightening. And how was I going to get a voice that would be right? And I think the issue then becomes, it's about class. And then once you're thinking about it primarily in that way, then it was, having had a very good class education in all sorts of interesting ways in my life, it was accessible to me. Although Parrot's certainly an Englishman, he's a sort of an Englishman that would exist very easily in Australia. And so he felt close and ready at hand. And the thing about the Kelly gang was that Ned Kelly himself actually wrote a letter, which he dictated to one of the gang members, and who was a little not particularly interested in the comma and other conventions. And so you got in the letter that this Australian bushranger left to be printed after a robbery in about 1860, I think. This impassioned plea in a sort of an Irish voice, filled with memories of injustice against the Irish from the British, and it just, when it was readable, which was not always, it really rolled along beautiful. At the age of 21, having just read James Joyce, I then read this, and I thought one could make a work of literature from something that relates to, is very deep in Australian soil, that comes out of this voice. And then, because I'd been to a country school, all that language, I first went to school, about 1948 or 50 or something, I don't know. But in a small country town in
Bacchus Marsh. Did I get that right?
No, Bacchus Marsh.
Close.
Close, you were good. Anyway, so it's all within reach, is what I mean. So, you've been down the pub, and
that within reach is very nice.
So you can reach out and touch it. So it wasn't really a stretch. It was something that felt very, very familiar, and I always felt I wasn't sure I could write the book, but I was sure I could do the voice.
Yeah, well, it's it has immediate and fantastically eloquent credibility. The French aristocrat is, you said again, sort of Tocquevillian character that you arrived at it quite quickly and then sort of ran with it. But I mean, there is a sense in which whether or not you read letters of the period. I have to say,
yes, I did.
You did.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, and obsessively and anxiously,
Okay.
and made hundreds of notes I couldn't read afterwards. But yes, I was terribly concerned to know as much as I could because I knew nothing. Because I wanted to make something up. And in attempting to justify myself, which one seems called upon to do, perhaps because we no longer quite believe in the imagination as we once did, but what it is that I've done to poor old Alexis, I started to think about paintings. And I started to think about, and in my mind, in my book, Tocqueville is there in the underpainting. And sometimes you see and recognize, if you're looking closely at the painting, you see parts of Tocqueville in there, and you can look and see it, and you can think of me, like a collagist. You could think of me a lot like God, who do I want to say? Rauschenberg, say, and in all the layers of stuff. So you might glimpse Tocqueville, and then that might refer to the made-up things, and then it might refer to what you know and what you're looking at, and all of those things. So the fact that you see Tocqueville through the paint is important, but it's not him.
Right. Voice is that, at the beginning of the march, there's a southern voice, southern female voice, and then we switch to Pearl, who's the girl. I mean, again, was there? Did you not necessarily bury yourself in southern letters or literature or something, but you thought hard about these different voices?
I'll tell you the feeling of that. It came upon me suddenly that most of my books, or many of them, are in the first person, because there's a tremendous narrative advantage to having someone, to have a fictional voice, throwing your own voice into that person who's involved in the action of the book, but also narrating it. It's a very useful device. But this one, there's the omniscient author who very freely invades the minds of very many different characters. And that came without my thinking about it too carefully, but along the way, I decided this was my Russian novel. That if you're going to write about something like this and see how it affects the lives of so many people, you really have to dispose your thoughts and observations through a large range of characters, and it was the idea of the movement of those people. What I learned from that book, because of course the book gives things to you as you work on it, and it showed me that it was an entire civilization had been uprooted and was on the road, and security for people was no longer in their attachment to the land or their homes. It was to attach themselves to this movement. So it wasn't just 60,000 men living off the land and going down from Georgia to the Carolinas, but it was all the people who uprooted the African Americans who'd been freed, who couldn't stay behind, because the Confederates were out to get them, and then the wealthy white people who'd lost their plantation. So the whole society was on the road, and it came to be a kind of a road novel. But when you're doing these things, you don't know when you're beginning exactly how things will turn out. If we could all be sure what things were going to turn out, we'd write masterpieces every time instead of just occasionally.
One of the wonderful things about that book is a lot of the, I think anyway, is that a lot of the figures in it cross boundaries. People dress in the clothes of the other gender. People switch between southern. There's a disastrous change of uniform. Two soldiers at the beginning. So was that consciously part of?
No, that sort of happened, and that too was a revelation of the book, that people would have to be transformed in their identities because the radical material changes their lives suffered. And the two soldiers, the two renegade Southern soldiers, Arlie and Will, who keep changing their uniforms in order to survive, only one person ever figured out where I got that idea. And that was the late Studs Terkel, who said, "This reminds me of Bill Malden's World War II cartoons of Willie and Joe, two dog feet with the rain coming down, and they're playing with their helmets." And generally,
we've lost you on the
yes,
Look at that.
is that better?
No. Oh, yeah, a little improv, no. Yeah.
This was known as suspense.
But still not working.
No.
Is that maybe?
No?
Maybe it is.
Sure.
Yeah, it is now. Yeah.
It works
Well,
if you hit it.
What was I saying?
The two World War soldiers, two World War II soldiers.
Yeah, those two characters seem to have been inspired by these cartoons of World War II.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, can I just ask you about the voices, particularly in the Wyoming stories as well? You live there. You live there now, I think, or you did live in Wyoming for a while. And
Yes.
do you hear those voices
I
now?
still live there. Yeah.
Or,
I find it enormously difficult to write in the first person, so I almost never do. And the voices there in those stories are partly a reflection of local phraseology, older phraseology, and mythology. Wyoming is a place that depends heavily on its myths, so a certain amount of mythical language creeps in. I kept it simply because it felt right, but that's about it. I'm not very adventurous in trying out different voices and so forth, and certainly not the first person. I would feel embarrassed, I think, at getting into the story, even just mentally. So I like the distance between me and the characters. But at the same time, I don't want them to appear distant and hard and unreachable, even though they may be.
Accordion Crime, so goes across a great sweep, not just of time, but different ethnic groups. Did you think about cadence of different styles to speak?
I wanted to do something I simply wasn't enough of a writer to do with that book, because each of the 8 or 9 different nationalities that are figured in that book had really discrete and interesting and fascinating kinds of music that were part of their culture. I thought that somehow it would be possible to catch some of the rhythms of the music in the sentence structures, and I simply couldn't do it. No.
Doesn't feel like that to a reader, you say. It does. I mean, the Italian scenes at the beginning do have a very, absolutely different kind of verbal music to this reader anyway than Swedish ones and Polish ones.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I haven't looked at it for a long time, but I remember finishing the book with a sense of bitter disappointment.
The mark of a great writer, I think, actually, too. How about over time? I mean, within Wyoming, I mean, the figures in 1970s and 80s have a different kind of way of expressing themselves than 1920s and 30s? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they do. And I think a lot of that does come from reading some of the old letters and accounts and memoirs, some of them collected by the WPA people in the 30s. Those made rather wonderful reading in all of the states, the archives of the WPA local history collected, because a lot of it is just written down exactly as it was said, and so you get interesting expressions and phraseology and references that no longer exist. So this kind of thing is quite fascinating. Getting into archives always is a pleasure.
Yeah, well, that's nice for someone who does it as a sort of meat and potatoes job too. It is, isn't it? Can I ask you slightly different tack, which I hope you won't mind being asked about. But you've all had movie versions of your books. Actually, I don't know if it was happy experience or unhappy experience, or how far you were involved, or. Tell me about that. In two of your stories, in fact.
Yes. You know what I think is at the basis of writers having movies made of their books is consorting with the genitals of money. Someone has described it. But I think if most writers had their druthers, they'd rather people would read the books. But that's not the time we live in. So,
you don't think they did as a result of, Shipping News and Brokeback Mountain?
No, not Brokeback Mountain. People did not read that because my publisher, The New Yorker, and Amazon, I think, it was a short story to begin with, not a whole novel, put it online. So it was downloaded. People didn't have to buy the book. They could just download
good
the
work,
story.
guys. Right.
And you, had Ragtime went multimedia, really, including singing, dancing version.
I thought the first 10 minutes of that film were pretty good. Unfortunately, it went on for over 2 hours.
You didn't like Jimmy Cagney?
No, that was a bit of miscasting, I thought. No, I think 5 films have been made of my work.
Wow, Billy Bathgate, Ragtime.
Bathgate, Ragtime, Book of Daniel.
Book of Daniel.
A film called Daniel, but that's probably the best of them. A great commercial failure, too, I might say. But
you say that with bizarre satisfaction, actually.
yeah, well, there's some brilliant things in that film. It's not entirely successful, but I have found working with directors that there's always, somewhere along the line, you hear what I call the one disastrous idea. And you hear that idea and you know that the film is finished, it's over. For instance, in the Ragtime film, Milos Forman, who replaced Robert Altman, said he thought a film should always be about one person. That was his one disastrous idea. The fact of the matter is that films are not a credential for a writer. The money is good, but I'm sure my colleagues have been in a situation where they've gone to speak somewhere, and by way of preparation, the local English department has filmed the film based on a book. And
you're being filmed right now, you know that.
Yeah,
Okay.
as if it's a kind of credential, and it just doesn't work that way. I have a lot to say if we have another hour or two about film, but people speak of film language. I don't think there is such a thing. I think, as a matter of fact, Robert Altman once told me, he said, by the time I decide where to put the camera and how to dress the actors and how to instruct them and put them in the set and light the set and maybe drop in a little bit of music, 98% of the meaning of that film is delivered before a character says one word. Even the way you dress the hair of the actors. Did you know that hair is very important in movies? It's a sign of age, social class, education. It's all indicative. And this is the way films work. There's no language involved. It's an oxymoron.
Sounds like politics, actually. Hair, no language. It's like Ronald Reagan.
That's right. So I don't know. It's sort of like hieroglyphics film. But I mean, I grew up on the movies. I love movies.
Would you mind seeing a bit of just 3 minutes of a movie, which is Visconti's version of The Leopard? I'd love you to respond. Would that be unbearable or okay? Yeah. It's good. Can we? I'm supposed to then get out. This is naughty of me, but I do love The Leopard particularly. Okay, I'm supposed to do that Shazam, which says roll the first clip. I probably should have introduced it to you. It's a story of played by Burt Lancaster, The Princess Elena in Sicily. Great novel written by Lampedusa, who was an aristocrat himself. The moment represented is a plebiscite in their little patrimonial town in the center of Sicily, a place that actually exists called Donnafugata. where the prince, who's decided to embrace the new order of initially dominated by hard men, political and economic, from the north, in order that things should stay the same, does his duty with a great deal of distaste. I think Burt Lancaster's hair quite good there, actually, at least facial hair, and votes yes. And what was interesting to me, but two things, I guess, is that it seems to me Visconti, who made the film, was himself an aristocrat, but a very different kind of aristocrat from Lampedusa, Marxist, romantic, operatic from the north. Lampedusa, much more kind of clipped, economic, sardonic, droll, really, rather tragic in his view. Visconti does, nonetheless, I don't know if you think, sort of does create a credible world of this moment of dust and the political compromise. But he does make some, he does make some sort of really interesting, I'm not going to find it there, but it doesn't really matter. Visconti does make two very interesting changes, which one in there's only about 3 or 4 pages of this plebiscitary moment. He says, actually, that the Jesuit priest had been very careful, because the Jesuit priest would have voted no and would have only cast the only no vote. The Jesuit priest was very careful not to register himself as a resident of the town. As you saw in the clip, the priest simply looks concerned that he might be forced to do something that would compromise him, giving the prince, Burt Lancaster, the opportunity to say, Father Pironi is not a resident of here, and there's a kind of smile on the face of the priest as he does that. There are lots of little, and I don't know if it happened, maybe Oscar and Lucinda, there were changes, and you thought, I actually meant the opposite of what happened in the film, Peter, or didn't you?
Well, I never expect a film to be a book. I mean, a book to be a film, really. You know what I mean? They're so different that I think that...
You just stand back once it's underway.
It's the safest thing to do.
That's a smart... The thing, and everything gets, I mean, in the case, to shift away from this film, which I like very much, to the film Oscar and Lucinda, which was made by a whole lot of people who loved the book, and the people would have been paid more money to do other things, and they did it because they loved it. But the thing of all the things about a film like that, when you write a novel, and we were talking about point of view before, you can have this, you can be so distant from your character. I'm thinking about Oscar in particular. He's like an ant, and he's a rather humorous little ant, and you take pity on him, and then you're inside him, and you're moved by his heart and his predicament. And the film really doesn't give you that ability to look at the character in so many different ways. And so the film can never really feel to me like my book. But I didn't expect that. And the thing also is, a book's made out of these little symbols on paper, and a film's made of light and electricity. How could they ever be anything like each other? But they can just do different things. I mean, I think the wind and the dust in the beginning of this is just masterful. I mean, everybody is playing to the wind and the dust. Every single thing that happened is about the wind and the dust, and it symbolically sort of works rather well.
Like Carlos Saura's La Carta, which also has lots of wind and dust and heat.
And you worked in the movie. I mean, you were close to that. That's why you would want another hour or so. Do you think there's ever been a good, not necessarily of your own work, a movie adaptation where you said, well, that really wasn't, that wasn't a disgrace in terms of a movie version of a book?
I'm really sorry we've started talking about movies.
We can stop.
I thought we were here to talk about books.
Well, we are, but
the world we live in, the movie is the imprimatur these days.
They're all over the place, movies. I'm beginning to resent them terribly. And
Too late.
And I think of what they cost. It's really obscene. $150 million. If a director wants it to rain in a film, he has to hire a rainmaking machine, which costs anywhere from $60,000 to $80,000 or up per day.
That much?
Yeah. That's used to be the price, probably more than that now. If I want to make it rain, I have a technology that cannot be beat. It's a 4-letter word called rain, R-A-I-N. I can modify it. I can make it a gentle spring rain. I can make it a terrible storm, throw in a tornado, all sorts of things with that one little word. So I don't know why people think films can do anything, but they can't. I think books can do anything.
Yeah, good. Well, New Yorker Festival, we should all agree with that. Now I'm really asking for it now, actually. But do any of the three of you ever read non-fiction about the past?
Oh, Simon, I love the book.
About what?
Citizens is a great book.
No, let's see. Non-fiction history. I mean, you did a history degree. I mean, and do you have, do you think non-fiction?
That's all I
non-fiction.
read. I never read novels.
Is that right? What was the last, history book you really loved?
It's not really history. It's Brian Fagan's The Little Ice Age, which I liked very much indeed.
Right. And I mean, somewhere you were quoted as saying there is no fiction, non-fiction, only narrative. I mean, is that so?
Yeah, that was a novelist's remark, I think. But not all historians are as generous to fiction writers as you were, if I may say so.
Yeah, you really think they are?
Matter of fact,
strictly about it.
As a matter of fact, let me quote something you said.
So mean. I had this coming to me, really. Actually.
You said in Harvard Magazine in 1991, so far from the intellectual integrity of history being policed by the protocols of objectivity, distance, and scientific dispassion, its best prospects lie in the forthright admission of subjectivity, immediacy, and literary imagination. History's mission, if there be such, is to illuminate the human condition through the witness of memory, and so the truths likely to be yielded by such histories are in effect closer to the truths of the great novels and the great poets than the general laws offered by ambitious social scientists. Let's have a hand for
that. Shucks. It's definitely time to open up the discussion to you lot. We'd love to hear questions from you that will provoke the panelists even more than they've been provoked already. We have, as usual, the form, the microphones at the front that you can ask your questions from. Please don't be shy. We can have lights up. Again, we're going to skip the second clip. I've agreed. Don't need any more movie. Good. So I'm now looking for questions from you. Yes, over there.
I'll go first. I'd like to ask a process question. I read all kinds of fiction and nonfiction, and I particularly enjoy historical fiction ranging from Ivan Doig to David Mitchell to Hilary Spurlane to all of you, of course. But I read partly because, for me, it illuminates the past, and I find myself making a judgment as to how much is accurate and not. But I'd like to know, if you would, from each of you, how you do research, how you think about it. Maybe just in a few sentences, because I don't want to monopolize this.
Okay. I was asked to repeat the question, but why would I? I think it was only in case the, you all heard the question, right? Yeah, good. Then there's no. Yes, please. In any order. Eka? Yeah.
How do we research things? As we go along, is the way I do it. I've known too many writers who've exhaustively researched whatever they wanted to write, And when it came time to write, they were dead in the water. They were finished. They were too overwhelmed by what they knew. Here's my idea of research. You mentioned ragtime. There's a scene there where Tata and the little girl take trolley cars, one after another, from New York up to Lowell, Massachusetts. They come to the end of a line, and they wait for the next interurban trolley. I knew there were a lot of trolley cars in those days. So I wrote that scene, and I loved it, but I didn't know if it was really possible to take trolley cars up to Massachusetts from New York. So this was before Google, you understand. So I was wandering around in the midterm branch of the public library through the stacks, and there were some books, oversized books sticking out of a shelf, and I banged my knee on one of these books. So I picked it up, and it was a corporate history of trolley car companies in America. And it told me everything I need to know, and that's my idea of research.
Sure.
when you're writing in a book, you do create a little magnetic field around yourself, and whatever you need will one way or another come to you. That's what I think.
Yeah,
Annie?
very much the same kind of situation. I was driving one time through Minnesota, I think, and came into some flat land with fifth growth saplings and an enormous sign that said, on this site in 1890 grew the most mighty pine forest in the world. And of course there wasn't a pine tree in sight, not even the stumps remain. This was years ago, more than 25 years ago. But I didn't forget it, and I'm just now getting around to writing about that. So, things happen, you think about it, they stay with you and surface later.
Yeah. I mean, and Ed uses his knee. I've found the elbow very useful in my work. To be
Alternative cartilage, yeah.
different, whole different lot of injuries. But to be mildly serious and in the other direction, I mean, I think basically we do everything and anything we need, and it happens in all sorts of different ways. But when I took on the task of imagining this French aristocrat who was going to have some resemblance to Tocqueville, I was so overcome being able to imagine it that I found a friend of a friend who knew a French architectural historian who went out, and we spoke basically sort of Google English, sort of, a lot of French or whatever, Babel or something. And he found the Tocqueville, the chateau where Tocqueville had done it, which had never been a public building, and was a convent. And got in there, and he drew maps for me of where the chateau had been, where the woods would be, where the vegetable gardens were, what sort of thing.
Wow.
And all of the plans of the second floor and the first floor, and where Tocqueville's mother would have had a thing, and the father, all on and on and on. And so I saw that, and I really wanted, like the thing about the geography or geology. I wanted to know the forces at work of sort of making the person. And once I had that, and he'd done this beautiful work, I then made it up. Because I'd learnt from the research what the sort of rules were and how those rules might affect behaviour or in the space. But I think the poor guy, he worked so hard. And when it comes out in French, which I will soon, he'll read it, and he will not know.
He'll be thrilled.
He'll be thrilled.
He'll be thrilled.
He's nice, man.
What about the Dipnoth printers? Because that's an incredibly vivid, bizarre, and extraordinary, and utterly credible account of.
Totally invented, completely in every way invented. In every way invented. I mean, it's there because this is a printer that.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything about it? Well, the physical space is very important.
Oh, God. I don't know where to begin talking about it. It's really there because I needed them to get on a convict ship that went from somewhere in England, so that's Plymouth.
Right.
What's near Plymouth? Dartmoor,
Right.
Devon. So I put the printery there because I want to because they're going to go up into the moor and down onto the ship. And so I found out about Dartmoor, which I've never been to, and the sort of architecture and the priest holes and all those things, just sort of making stuff up and fitting things together. Okay. But I'm pleased you like it because I liked it too.
Yeah, very much. Yes. Yes, lady.
There's a book by Mark Carnes called Novel History. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. He also has one called Film History, where he has historians and novelists who write novels set in historical times kind of debate the issue. And it's there's some prickliness in it and some issues where historians get kind of ticked off at certain kinds of mistakes and allow other kinds of mistakes. Or imagined differences to slip by. And I wondered if there were any places in any of your works where you'd been caught out with inadvertent, you can't know everything, however you do your research. You can't know everything. And I wondered if there were any places where some historian had sort of done a gotcha.
Well, no, but I mean, we did. I mean, I remember writing a book of mine called Lillywacker, which was a long time ago, and I wrote it like in the same spirit that Edgar wrote his trolley cars, and I had them listening to the radio in Geelong in 1921, and at a certain stage I discovered there was no radio in Geelong in 1921, and so the line in the chapter says they will tell you there was no radio in Geelong in 1921, but I'm telling you that it was. So. And so that sort of worked for that particular instance.
Yeah, I haven't had that experience yet. And even if I do, I probably wouldn't pay much attention to it. It's my book, my story, my history.
Yeah. That's our shop. We like small shopkeepers.
So back off that, please. Yeah, yes. Okay.
I did make apparently made a mistake in my first novel, which takes place, Welcome to Hard Times it's called, takes place in the Dakota Territory in the 1870s. And in that, in chapter 5 or so, I have one of the characters named Jenks who makes his dinner out of the roast haunch of a prairie dog. He's very poor. I remember that. Very poor. Very poor, and I wrote that novel. I never had been out. I never was west of Ohio when I wrote that novel. In fact, I thought Ohio was the West. So the book was published. It got pretty good reviews, and I thought I'd really pulled a fast one like Kafka, who wrote a book called America without ever having left Prague. And then I got a letter from an elderly woman in Texas. I knew she was elderly. It was a very fine, old-fashioned hand. And she said, Mr. Doctorow, I was with you all the way till you had Jenks have his dinner of a roast haunch of a prairie dog. At that moment, I knew you'd never been west of Ohio.
A prairie dog full grown is about that long.
Amazing. She said because the roast
tapas, really.
She said the roast haunch of a prairie dog wouldn't fill a teaspoon.
But again, not as bad as the mistakes that can be made in movies. My favorite was actually, I can't remember the name of the film, but it was set in the grimmest military conflicts of the middle of the 17th century, of course. And the sort of grumpy peasant says to grumpier peasant wife, well, me dear, I'm off to fight the 30 Years' War. So terrible mistake and amazingly far-sighted. Actually, my colleague Mark Carnes, actually, I surrendered to this, one of those books, and I knew all my colleagues would say, oh, well, in such and such a scene there was a kind of shocking departure in front, and I thought, I don't want to hear this over and over again. So I was actually given Abel Gance's Napoleon to talk about. I was assigned that. So what I simply did, which troubled everybody, it was a naughty thing to do, even by my standards. I had Napoleon himself review it and say it was never like that. You know, I was incredibly tall, actually.
Those are legion, the movie mistakes, like the name of the rose. In the opening scenes, here we have a medieval village and a lot of snow on the ground and enormous tractor marks in the snow. Right in the first scene. Forget it.
But they can be even more economical than writing R-A-I-N. I remember Nicholas and Alexandra, these two people standing in a room, and the third one walks in and says, Trotsky, my name's Stalin. Have you met Lenin? All there, done in a second, the entire history of the Russian Revolution. You have another question, gentleman here. You need to go to a mic. I'm so sorry. It's a pain, isn't it? So sorry about that. Partly because we are being filmed. Thank you.
Can I ask Annie Poole, it's fascinating how you uncover the language of small people, working people, and jobs that no longer exist, and the tools they use. It's a kind of the little people history of our part of the world. And I also have fun with the names you find for your characters. Could you let us in on some of the secrets?
There are no secrets. In reference to the little people, I guess it takes one to know one. In reference to working at long-forgotten trades, I'm in that business myself. And as for the names, I started doing that long ago because I was sick and tired of novels where everyone had East Coast Anglo-Saxon names, and I was constantly having to turn back to find out who they were talking about. Everybody sounded very similar. But for a while I was using medieval theologians for characters' names. I had a rodeo rider named Dunny Scotus. and that was sort of fun. That was sort of fun. But it's mostly a mnemonic device for the reader and for me, too.
You two, you've both got stories with the name Parrot in it, actually. Do you know? We know you do, but Annie also has Charlie Parrot, I seem to remember.
Yeah, I stole it from her.
Who got, yes, she got to her parrot first.
We have an understanding about this.
No, we have time for just a couple more questions. I'll take one there, and then, yes, and then you next, yeah.
As much as we all appreciate fiction, I think our society is looking at long-term trends that tell us that people have less ability to discern fact from fiction. So if you look at the statistics on high school students and their ability to identify the capitals of the 50 states, et cetera, what do you think is going to be the trend then in what I will, begging your forgiveness, call historical fiction, and the use of historically accurate characters in fiction over the next decade or so?
I'm no futurologist, so I'm just going to hang on, wait, and see.
Peter?
Well, I at the beginning of the question, what you're saying is that people are really not going to be able to tell the difference between fact and fiction, and therefore we will be hugely irresponsible making things up. I think the concern my concern is a greater one, I think, which is that we've come to accept that we're going to live in a society where people really won't read very much. And that's the big issue, and that's a big issue, I think, and that really is, because when we're getting stupider and stupider, and we're unable to defend ourselves and inform ourselves, so that makes us politically incredibly vulnerable. I mean, as to how we govern ourselves and so on. So this is the big issue which if it was something, well, we wouldn't have actually, but just let's say we were better than we are and you knew you were going to make a hole in the ozone layer, yeah, you'd realise it was important and you wouldn't do it. And I think that what we're doing about, with literacy in our society and our great excitement about apps and all these wonderful toys, which, of course, I totally endorse.
Tomorrow's buggy whips.
Yeah.
You know,
I think we're in a really sick and sorry state, and we're sliding towards something much worse, and we're not doing anything about it.
The pit.
there is a, I don't know if you know this, but Madam, in England there's a King Richard III Society that was formed to recover the reputation of Richard III from the terrible calumnies of Shakespeare's play. And their position...
From Thomas More, actually. So
their position is that Shakespeare got his idea of Richard III from Holinshed's Chronicles, who in turn had depended on Sir Thomas More, who was, among other things, a publicist for the Tudor element. And the Plantagenets were destroyed in the Battle of Bosworth Fields in 1485. And so the King Richard III Society says that he was actually a good, kind king. He was not a serial murderer. And we've got to do something about this. So I ask you, which would you rather have? The recovery of Richard III's reputation on behalf of the society or Shakespeare's play?
Well, that's a very, very quick one, actually.
Yeah. My question is sort of about political change in your work, or your desire to bring about political change.
No, it should be the kind of question, who would you like to have to dinner between Sir Thomas More and Richard III? Actually.
Right.
Okay, political change.
So,
in 30 seconds.
Yes, I'm just interested in Book of Daniel, Ace in the Hole, things like that describe. Is it your desire to use your tool in writing to bring about political change through your work?
No.
No. Perfect. And?
What shall I say to a question like that?
Yes or no?
No. No, it requires more of an answer.
Yeah.
You don't write to make a political point. You don't write a tract. You don't try to prove anything. Whatever ideas you have must come out of the book itself organically, or the book will be dead. There is a tradition of political novel writing in Europe. It doesn't really exist here. There's no critical fraternity to support political novels. That's why you don't really see many novels since the 1930s that have strong political content. You don't see many novels about unions, working people. You don't see novels really about radical dissidents at all in this country. I think all novels have a political quality to them, and depending on how they're interpreted, in what age they're interpreted. Every one of us writes constantly political novels, even Jane Austen, who was actually writing a novel about paternalism and the subjugation of women, if you want to interpret that novel that way. Anyway, it's not going to hurt you to read the Book of Daniel.
I'll say just the subject matter of all of our, three writers who I want to thank and have the audience thank as well, is essentially the condition of humanity, and for that, as well as for their extraordinary literary gifts and for their being here, you'll join me in thanking them.